Ahoy there, fellow travelers. Welcome to E-Travels with Trules, a personal and literary podcast of travel adventures and misadventures from around the world. This is Eric Trules, and thanks for listening. Welcome to E-Travels with Trules, behind the scenes. I'm Eric Trules, and today I'll be talking with the producer of my podcast, Harry Duran, host of Podcast Junkies, talking about all things podcast and travel. But before I get started with Harry, I'd like to give a shout out to all my new subscribers on iTunes, where the podcast is now live. Here's one of my favorite comments. Between the music, sound design, and pleasant low rumble of Trules' voice, this is a podcast that will satisfy that craving for a story that lets you live by your mind's eye. That's by listener Irma Gerd, who I don't know, but that's part of the joy of podcasting, isn't it? And here's another one by Dean Sullivan 18. Trules has a wonderful quality of engaging his listeners, where he will transport you from your living room couch to vast corners of the world. Thanks to Irma, Dean, and the rest of my new subscribers. I really appreciate your signing up for the podcast and taking the time to rate and review it. And if you're listening, please do the same and tell your friends. Okay, so now for Behind the Scenes at E-Travels with E-Trules, where I'll be talking with my collaborators, my friends, my colleagues, my listeners, and fellow travelers, and hopefully with my new listeners, fellow podcasters, creators, and travelers who I haven't met yet, about the show, about their lives, and about their travels around our big, beautiful, and problematic planet. Harry Duran is my podcast guru, guide, and guest today. For the past 2 years plus, Harry has been the host of Podcast Junkies, a.k.a. The Podcaster's Voice. It's a weekly conversation with a wide array of interesting and engaging podcasters. Some of his most memorable guests have included Mark Maron, executive producer Brendan McDonald, Leah Tao, host of Strangers, Helen Zaltzman, host of The Illusionist, and Jordan Harbinger, host of The Art of Charm. He currently resides in Los Angeles with his wife of 10 years plus, Natalie, and their Yorkie, Disco. He's also founder of Fullcast, a full-service, done-for-you podcast production and marketing company. Welcome to the show, Harry.
Great to be here, Eric. Thanks for having me.
As I said, I'm new to podcasting. I've had a long life in the arts, but although I've always wanted to be on radio, now suddenly radio is accessible to anybody with a microphone who wants to create a podcast. Not that it's all that easy, and although I know story, and I hope these travel stories are engaging and entertaining, I knew and know nothing about the business and technology and construction of putting a podcast on the air. And so I feel really lucky to have run into you and for you to grace me with your expertise. So what's it like to help somebody launch a podcast?
Well, as you mentioned in the introduction, I had a fascination with learning how to engage with people that were interesting for me in what I was, my current hobby at the time. I grew up DJing, so I've been a DJ for 20 plus years, and one of my first forays into online marketing and entrepreneurship was trying to create a mobile app for electronic music DJs. So I went to a conference called New Media Expo in early 2014 to learn how to do podcast, because my thought was I was going to interview other DJs. I quickly realized it was going to be really hard to get in contact with the folks at that level that I wanted to meet, just because of all the barriers you'd have to go through. But while at that conference, I saw so many other podcasters who were really inspiring, and I thought, well, why not interview them and find out their backstory? So the podcast is a little meta because it's a podcast about podcasting. And believe it or not, there's about 30 or 40 that can count off the top of my count on one hand that are podcasts in the same format. But essentially, I lined up the first few podcast interviews. I was really nervous at the beginning. I had my list of questions because I didn't want there to be any dead air during the interview. But then I quickly realized it's natural to just have a conversation with people and not have prepared questions. If you think about your best conversations that you've had with friends, they just seem like natural discussions between two people who are interested in what the other has to say. And I quickly realized over time that those are the best types of conversations to have. And it's been 112 interviews now that I've had over 2.5 years. And I've had a really great time, and I've really made some made some good friends and met some fascinating people.
It's really impressive, and you seem to know everybody in the field. And since I'm new to the field, what's interesting and unique to me is that the personalities in the field seem so much different than the worlds of Hollywood and theater, the worlds that I've been so involved with over the many years that I've been in Los Angeles, mostly in terms of people's support of one another. There seems to be less egos and competition, and it's not about my podcast is the best and I'm going to kill, like comics say all over the world. It seems to be a mutually supportive environment and genre that's very welcoming. You're welcoming me and agreeing to produce the podcast, and all the people I've met. I went to 2 events. I met a woman, a very nice woman named Valerie Geller, who's a radio producer. She sent me to Podcasts and Pizza, run by Ben Adair in Silver Lake. I think it was one of the few meetings you weren't at. And I met Joe Berman from Pod to Pod, and I met some other people. And the guests that day were 3 producers of the LA Podcast Festival, which was happening the very next weekend. So I bought a 1-day ticket, and my goal was to find a producer. And there I was on a drink line, and your friend Z, who I had just met, introduced us, and within an hour, you said you would produce my podcast, and I went home. Oh, in fact, I gave you a ride home.
Mission accomplished.
So I felt very lucky, and I still feel quite grateful and supportive and educated about how to make a podcast. And that's thanks to you.
So for the listeners who aren't familiar with the California area, Silver Lake is a neighborhood in California. Z is Christina Holly, and host of the Art of Manufacturing podcast, which is a really great show. And that's the nature of podcasting and the podcasting community. Sometimes you'll meet someone who knows someone who can connect you to something that you may need for your show or just to get started. I found that to be the same experience. I've been going to podcasting conferences this is my 3rd year now. There's a really big one called Podcast Movement. The first 2 years were in Dallas. The 3rd year was in Chicago. It's been growing exponentially. This past year in Chicago, there were 1,600 people at the conference. In 2017, it's going to be in Anaheim. And I imagine they're going to want to get close to 2,000 people, 2,000 podcasters in the same room. What's fascinating about that, Eric, is that it's really become a place where you go to meet and hang out with your tribe, because everyone there is talking podcasting, albeit at different levels. And some people are just getting started. Some people have been doing it for years. Some people have been doing it for 10 years. And they come and they share their wisdom with the community, and they're really open about it. I've heard people that go to other conferences, like photography conferences, and they say, everyone's not as friendly as they are in the podcasting community. And here we just look out and we try to help out each other. We do it in online communities as well, but there's a sense of family and a sense of reunion every time I go to these conferences, because at this point I'm seeing friends that I've known for 2 or 3 years, and sometimes I only get to see them at the conference. And so it's nice to see them, nice to hang out with them. And I think that's just the nature of the podcasting community.
It seems like almost a solo act with a single host that has to create and self-promote their own podcast. But it doesn't really work that way, it seems. It seems like hosts bring on other podcasters, and the sense of community is outstanding. And I know what you're excited and what people are talking about. To the mainstream outside world, this seems like a new medium in the Wild West, and maybe a place to monetize and advertise. And I understood Virgin Airlines is sponsoring a new show, and there are agents coming into the world. And it's good to be on, for me, a ground floor. You're probably on the third or fifth floor, but it's interesting.
I think what you realize is you don't have to know everything at the beginning. And I think you just learn from people like myself. And eventually at some point after doing this for some time, you're going to find yourself giving advice to new podcasters. And that's why in this community, it's really important to give of what you know. And you may think that you don't have a lot to give in the podcasting world, but you do have experience traveling. You do have experience telling stories. You do have experience speaking in public. And these are skills that new podcasters may not have. So at these conferences, it's really important to try to talk to as many different people and see where you can make a connection and help someone take that next step in their show. And that's the nature, again, of this community. And that's why we go to these conferences, because we don't work and some of us do work in 9-to-5 jobs, but for the most part, it's a really insular activity, podcasting, because, we're here in a nice looking recording studio, but a lot of podcasters record out of their home and they don't get to interact with people. So they really look forward to some of these meetups that people have in Los Angeles. We have several meetups: the Podcast and Pizza meetup, the Los Angeles Podcasters meetup run by Esprit Devora. If you're listening to this, I'm sure there's a community in your neighborhood or in your city, which I highly encourage you to look out. Go to meetup.com, look for a podcasting community near you, and take advantage of the conferences. There's conferences. There's an LA There's another Podfest conference happening in Florida, in Orlando, Florida, in February. Midwest Podcasting Conference. So there's a conference in Pennsylvania, and there's a lot of these satellite conferences popping up. So I think if you spend a little bit of time, you'll find one probably within driving distance. And it's really important to connect and meet other podcasters to inspire you and see where you can help and where they can help you.
I come from the world of theater, and what's on the frontier there are fringe festivals based on the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, where I was lucky enough to perform a couple of times. But now they're all over America. And the easiest show to transport is a solo show, which is a little like a podcast for the stage. So it's one person with a chair or a couple of boxes as a set, and you can go to Denver and Florida and just all over this country. And if you had the resources, you could go all over the world to perform your solo shows. This is very attractive to me because in a world where you don't have much control, you have a great deal of control over your own podcast, particularly on the production level. And I know people have spoken very highly of the production value that we've been able to produce on eTravels with Trules. And that's mostly thanks to the sound studio we have here at USC, and the sound designer Alicia Bermudez, and the original music composer Amanda Yamate. And I feel quite lucky to be working here and to be able to pick and choose all the sound effects and the music design. And it's like creating art.
One of the phrases that you'll hear a lot in podcasting is this idea of theater of the mind. And the reason people are drawn to your show is because what you're doing with the music is you're painting this picture for them of what it's like with the music and with the effects, and they almost feel like they're transported to a different world. And even for this specific interview, I like to give the listener a taste of what it's like. We're in a recording booth, and Alicia and Amanda are actually outside on the other side of the window, and recording us as we speak. So what you'll find with podcasting and with podcast listeners, they always like to know the ins and the outs, and like of how an episode is recorded, how the sausage is made, if you will, because there may be aspiring podcasters out there, and if there's some wisdom you can impart or some inspiration to them. I think that's always important, because you never know when something you say on a show might inspire someone to take a next action.
Well, it's like planting a seed, and that's what I always talk about my years of teaching being. I always compare teaching to being a gardener. You plant a seed and you hope it will grow long after your classroom. So, certainly on the World Wide Web, when putting out a podcast, you have no idea who's going to hear it. Or, I did, one of my students did a solo performance show several years ago, and it was referred to Frank Capra's movie It's a Wonderful Life and Jimmy Stewart's character. If he hadn't lived, or by taking his life, jumping off that bridge, he would have, his non-existence would have affected so many lives, and each of our lives does affect so many people. So my student's monologue was about one of his high school friends committing suicide, and how close he was to committing suicide in high school, literally sitting in the tub when he heard Frank Capra's Christmas movie come on the air. And hearing that role of George Bailey not jumping off the bridge allowed Tommy Rudd Fleming to decide not to take his own life that night. And what's really interesting is that someone who came to that show that night, a USC student, was having a really hard time in school. And her mother had cancer and had just broke up with her boyfriend, and she was dropping out of school. Yet hearing Tommy's monologue that night had her perhaps make a different decision in life. And then one of the fellow students told this story at our school's graduation, and 1,000 parents and students heard it. And then I posted the story on the web, and my doctor read it and gave it to his interns. And that's the effect of the ripples, I called it. It's the ripples of making art and doing podcasts and putting yourself out there.
Yeah, that's really interesting because to my earlier point that you'll never know which piece of that story people would be most attracted to and take most of an interest in. I think a lot of people will be interested in your impetus for starting this actual podcast. And I'm sure this will be teased out through other behind the scenes episodes down the line. But I'm wondering if you could take a couple of minutes and talk about what inspired you to actually start this process.
Wow. I've been traveling for a long time. I've been an artist for a long time, first a modern dancer and then a solo performance artist. And it just seemed like it was a way to use my traveling as a medium, as a vehicle to make sense out of life, that it's not just about the great hotel and the pool and the package deal and the thrills and tequila you drink. But it's about seeing other cultures and how other people live, their dance, their dress, their music, their food, and how we're all connected in this world of borders and animosity and brother hating brother in the Middle East and in America and all over the world. Stories like your friend Leah Tao said, I heard on your podcast, connect us all. And I thought by focusing on travel stories, it in itself connects beyond borders. And whether you're in Bali or Amsterdam or Egypt or Kentucky, we all have these things in common. We all care about family and children and love and support and connection. And we're all part of the same human race and makes us all part of the same family. So somehow E-Travels with E-Trules is trying to make a contribution to this big, beautiful, problematic planet where we're all connected.
I'm sure it already has.
Okay, Harry Duran, it's time for the Trules Travel Quiz. Are you ready?
I don't think I have a choice. So.
Where were you born?
El Salvador.
Where are you from?
I would say I'm from New York, more specifically a city just outside of New York called Yonkers.
Where do you call home?
Now I call Los Angeles home, specifically the Silver Lake neighborhood.
What's your favorite place in the world?
Sunshine.
Are you a traveler?
I am a traveler. My wife and I really like to travel. We've been to some really exotic locations. Some of our favorites have been Machu Picchu, Buenos Aires. We've also been to Italy and Berlin and Paris.
Cool. What's one place that you've always wanted to go to where you've never been?
I think on the short list would be Australia, Sydney, Australia.
Why?
Well, I became more aware of it because of I have a business coach who's from Australia, and I've now seen a lot of his posts because he posts on Facebook Live, and I get a taste for what it's like there. And I think the fact that it's so far away, literally on the other part of the world, is something that's enticing to me. Quickly, like shortly behind that, I think is Japan, Tokyo, Japan, other parts of Japan as well.
Sorry, Harry, you only get one. What's your favorite city?
If I gun to my head, quick answer, I'd say I like Berlin. We had a really good time in Berlin, and we actually thought about moving there shortly after returning there because it's very similar to New York City, but it's at the end of the day, it's a little too similar in temperature as well.
What's your favorite park or non-urban place?
Well, recently we've been making trips out to Joshua Tree, and I think the fact that it's you have to travel several hours outside of the city to disconnect. The light pollution is less there. You can really get a great shot of the stars. I think last time we were able to see Saturn pretty clearly, and it's just a nice place to go to disconnect from not only electronics but also from humanity. And if you go with close friends, you can see some really beautiful sunsets and really recharge and reset.
Very nice. What's your favorite mode of transportation?
I'd have to say, if at all possible, and if I had my choice, it'd be my feet. Because one of the things my wife did before we moved to LA was to look up on Google most walkable neighborhood in Los Angeles. And Silver Lake came up because we're New Yorkers and we like walking everywhere, and we like having restaurants and bars and barbershops and groceries in walking distance.
Silver Lake, right near Echo Park, mi own barrio. Who do you like to travel with?
That'd be my wife.
No surprise. Two forks diverged in the road. Which way would you go?
Left.
Why?
Just I have to go with the impulse, to go left. And I think for me, it seems, even though it's if I overthought it, I'd probably pick the side of the brain that's the more creative side. But of course, it's the left side is the more logical side. But I think for me, the left I associate with more of the creative impulse, and because of left-handed people. So I think it's important to go with your impulse and not overthink things too much, because people tend to sit there at a crossroads and not make a decision. And I've had a recent insight where I felt like it's better to make a quick decision and work through the challenges of that later, as opposed to spending most of the time on the actual decision.
Final question. Where will you go when you die?
I love these lighthearted questions. I'm a believer in rebirth, but I think I'll be born into a higher version of myself, and the best part about it is that I'll get a lot of answers to questions I have about the meaning of life.
Okay, thanks for being on the show, Harry Duran, and thanks out there for listening. Happy trails and bon voyage. Original music composed by Amanda Yamate, sound designed by Alicia Bermudez, produced by Harry Duran at Fullcast. Please contact us with your feedback and to schedule an on-air interview. This podcast has been supported with the USC Capstone Grant. Special thanks to Phil Allen and the School of Dramatic Arts for their support.